Hello, my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Development. This module is Smart UI with Microsoft Graph. Interact with Microsoft Graph using Office 365 pickers and cards. Our agenda for this module consists of 3 sections. Interact with Microsoft Graph using Office 365 pickers. Interact with Microsoft Graph using Office UI Fabric cards. Interact with Microsoft Graph using adaptive cards. Interact with Microsoft Graph using Office 365 pickers has 2 main components. We're going to talk about the file picker or the OneDrive picker, and then we'll talk about pickers that are packaged with the Office UI Fabric. And then we'll see a demo of the OneDrive picker in action. The OneDrive file picker is intended to provide a file browse experience for Microsoft's OneDrive. This works with both consumer and OneDrive for business. The picker is delivered as an SDK. It's available across multiple platforms. A web or JavaScript platform, a native Android, and native Universal Windows platform. As you'd expect from a file picker, we get a file open experience. I can tell the picker what the initial location that I want to be displayed when I click Browse. In the screenshot you see here, it's the OneDrive for business for a specific user, which would be probably the most frequent. I can additionally include a filter to limit the types of files that I show. If I only want to show PowerPoint files, for example, I can certainly specify that. I can also specify how much or what types of metadata I want to be displayed in the file browse experience. After the user selects a file, we can either get a URL that will let us download the file, or we can get a URL that provides the web view, which would mean if it's a Word document, for example, I could get the Word Online URL. In addition, we can do a file save experience, which again provides a similar look and feel. However, this time I let the user select a folder in which to save a document. The OneDrive file picker will then stub out that file, if you will, and return information about that file for you that you could then use to post content to it. If you've done a file browse or a file picker experience in any other application, a lot of these familiar concepts will be very familiar to you. There are other pickers available as part of the Office UI Fabric. Office UI Fabric is a bunch of React components that are styled like Office 365. There is the people picker, which is probably the most popular that you would see. It lets us show information about a person or about a collection of people. It's a very full-featured picker, lets us customize and filter how things look and feel and how they act. But that's not the only picker. In addition, you have a date picker, which we can specify certain date boundaries that we want users to pick from. There's also a color picker or a color swatch picker that would let people get the color code for a certain thing. Those are less frequent. In our demo, we're going to talk about the people picker. So we'll switch to a demo now in which we'll demonstrate the OneDrive file picker and the Office UI Fabric people picker. In this demo, we will review how to add an Office 365 file picker or an Office 365 people picker to our own application to leverage that capabilities. First, I want to open up the starter project that's part of the lab files and show you how to get around, if you will. First thing I want you to notice is that the dependencies has a warning indicator, the NPM dependencies. This project uses ASP.NET Core MVC in addition to using React components, and those React components are built using TypeScript. React and TypeScript all build upon the JavaScript infrastructure using Node and NPM. So before I get started too far, I want to switch over and make sure that I'm running the correct version of Node. So in Visual Studio, I'm going to go to Tools and Options. And there's under the Web Package Management section, you'll see External Web Tools. And you'll notice there is the location of external tools. Visual Studio installs a version of Node when you include the web workload as part of Visual Studio. The version that you get is dependent upon the version of Visual Studio that you're running. Obviously, Visual Studio is updating quarterly or more frequently, so it's hard to be specific from an external point of view to say which version we have. So I like to rearrange the order of these files to start with what's in my path. If I'm going to install Node or use some kind of Node version manager, I can control what version of Node is in my path. Conversely, I can also make sure the Node modules folder is loaded locally. So I want to make those two paths more prevalent, or to be used first, instead of what is shipped with Visual Studio. I'm also going to switch over now to the command prompt and make sure I'm in the folder that contains the package.json file. So you see here I'm in the folder that has my project, and I have a package.json. And since I'm in this folder, I am then going to run npm install. This will then install all the packages that I've declared as required for this project. There are add-ins to Visual Studio that will do this when you do a build. It'll do the package restore as well. However, I like to make sure this initial one is done initially on the command line so that I can make sure it gets installed correctly. While that runs in the background, I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio and review my project. As I mentioned, this is an ASP.NET project, ASP.NET Core project, so I have my controllers, and I have my home controller with a couple other pages. There's some stuff in here we're not going to review as part of this module. It just kind of supports the UI. The components folder has my TypeScript and the components that I will be building, so we'll be putting things in there. The www root folder ends up getting the compiled or the transpiled TypeScript, as well as any files that I might need to add get added in there as well. One thing I do want to point out, another thing to point out, is that the project is set to make sure that Webpack runs. I'm going to currently unload this, and then I'm going to view the CS proj file, and you'll notice down at the bottom there is a build target that's been extended. So before the build target runs, we want to execute our information here, right? And part of what we're going to run is the node Webpack command to use Webpack to build up this this project. Webpack has its configuration files. The TypeScript has its configuration files as well. These are all pre-built for you. You don't have to do anything with them. Just be aware that they're there, and some of the stuff that we write is going to, all the stuff we're going to write is client side, but there are some server side pieces that are supporting that as well. So now that we have covered that, we're going to then integrate the Office 365 file picker, or the OneDrive file picker. The OneDrive file picker, we're going to use the JavaScript version, but of course it requires an app registration. We need to register our application with Microsoft so that when the OneDrive file picker executes, it understands what context it's running. So I'm going to create a new application, and we're going to use this application registration in other places as well. So in addition to using the file picker, it's going to support the reading of data from Microsoft Graph to show information. The code that we're going to be using is going to leverage some Office 365 unified groups, so we're going to request permission for those as well. So I'm going to create my application, and then I need to set up a few different things, right? First, the OneDrive file picker is going to require that a secret is generated, or a public private key is generated. So I'm going to click on new. I'm going to click on new password. I'm going to generate a new password for this application. Now, at the moment, I don't necessarily need this password, right? But it's worth noting that whenever you generate one, you'll want to make a copy of it. So I'm going to do that as well, and we're just going to put this in my notepad. And then the other thing I'm going to want to make sure I make a copy of is the application ID. So these are information that we will then need to have for my application. Now, another item that we're going to require is the tenant ID for my tenant. So I'm going to open up a new window here, and I'm going to move to the Azure Portal so I can pull that information. We'll show you how to find that. So we'll do Portal. And in the Azure Portal, I'm logged in as my tenant administrator, so I'm going to go to Active Directory. I look in Azure Active Directory. Now, there's many places to see my tenant. The part I like to look at is the URLs that are specified for Azure Active Directory. So if I look in Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to come into Applications, and here are my endpoints. And so in this particular tenant, I'm going to scroll down to the it doesn't matter which endpoint I do, but if I look at the what gets included here, so again, we'll open Notepad. And if I paste that endpoint in here, you'll see I have my microsoftonline.com, and this is my tenant ID. So I'm going to copy this value as well because I want to have that for my tenant ID. So after having all that information available to me, I can now proceed with my application configuration. Right? And so the next step is to go through and configure what is known as the excuse me, as the redirect URL. Since I'm using the JavaScript version of the OneDrive file picker and I'm writing a web application to read the group, I need to create a web platform. Right? And when I do that, I end up with these redirect URLs. So the first one that I'm going to want is going to support just the web-based login. And so the first one I'll need to put in is this sign in OIDC. Now this localhost 44313 is the application and the port that my web application is going to be using. Right. What I'm going to need for the OneDrive file picker is another specific file. So I'm going to click Add URL and add another one. And this is my OneDrive file picker callback file. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then I'm going to need another one that hosts the group information that reads the server side that reads that. And so that's a file called A80 Tech Connected Tenant. We'll talk about that when we get to the last part of the module. So after having added all of those URLs, I will then click Save. Again, we want to make sure we have our app ID, which I've already copied. You'll notice it's registered in the Active Directory instance that's managing the logged in account. And now I need to grant permissions. So by default, the initial permission is just user read, and we need more than that. Our application is going to show information about the current user. It's going to show information about unified groups. So we need to do a collection of permissions. And I clicked the wrong button there. My apologies. So let me add the permissions that we're going to need. So these are in alphabetic order, so we're going to scroll down and we're going to choose directory.read.all because we want to read the directory. We want information about the user that would include their email, so we'll choose the email permission. Office 365 groups is going to require us to have group.read.all, and notice this is an administrative consent required. Right? So if doing this demo, you'll need to be able to log on as an administrator. Then the other information about the user that we care to require, number one, we want to have OpenID. I want to choose offline access as well because I want to get an offline token, and the user profile. So having selected all those, I click OK. They are then summarized here in this list here. You can compare that to the lab information. And again, I'll click Save. Make sure I get those all of that information. If I scroll down again, you can see this all is included. Next, I'm going to then update my application. So again, the starter application in web.config. In app settings. In the app settings file, we've already predefined some placeholders for you to enter this information. Right. So after the work we did to capture that information, I can now update this information. So we'll put this in here. And my app. The client secret is that password that we generated, so we'll want to make sure that's confusing. That's sometimes called secret, sometimes called password, but that is how this code is set up. The callback path is one that we've already specified. Notice the scopes that we're requesting here are the same. I got one more to do with the my domain here, so let's make sure we get that fixed. And in my particular example, I am using demo tenant, so let me just grab that value real quick here. And so after I've updated all this information, I can now run my application. When the application loads, it will immediately redirect you to log in with your Azure Active Directory account. So I'm going to enter that information in real quickly. And is going to now prompt me as the current user for information. It wants to read my profile, and you can see all the permissions listed there. I'm going to accept that. After I log in, I now see my homepage, Smart UI with Microsoft Graph. On the left-hand side, you'll notice I have a pickers navigation as well as a groups. I'm going to return back to my Visual Studio project, and I need to add the actual code required to implement the file picker. So first I'm going to do is navigate to my www root folder, and I'm going to add a new file here. I need that. If you remember, we registered a new page, a callback page. So this file will be an HTML page. And the name of this page will be OneDrive File Picker Callback. We don't need to provide any of the content for this page. This page is all provided by, rendered dynamically by the file picker. So all I'm going to do is paste in a snippet of code, and you'll notice it is just a script tag that then refers to the OneDrive JavaScript API, reading it live from the CDN. Right? Okay. Next, I want to make sure that my view implements this page. So I'm going to open up the index.cs HTML. Right? And one thing I want to notice here is that we have a button already predefined that's calling a client-side JavaScript. Right? At the bottom of the page is a section for scripts. This is how the Razor implements scripts. So I have this section for scripts, and so I need to put in a script that will then call into the OneDrive file picker. Now, first of all, I need to make sure that that same JavaScript from the CDN is running on this page, right? So we've already defined the callback page, which will handle the callback from OneDrive, but I need to have the API loaded here on this picker page as well. Right? After I've defined that, then I can write my code that will invoke this call. So I'm going to put in some inline script here, and this script will run in response to that click, right? So you'll notice it has the client ID. So this is the app, what we registered. We created registered an application. So an application or a client, we want to put that ID in here, right? And then I had defined a set of options. So this options object lets me customize how the OneDrive will work, right? And so I'm providing that ID. The action I'm performing is a query, which means I want to then do like a file open, if you will. I only want to have a single selection, and then I can pass in some information. What I'm going to pass in is this query parameters. And so this lets me define what metadata from my OneDrive library is shown and returned. And so what I'm returning is the name in the folder, so on, but I'm also including the download URL. From Microsoft Graph, I want the URL that I can use to download a file. And then after the user clicks OK, I want the browser to redirect to that page that I just added. Right? In addition, after the redirect happens, I can have I have a callback, so I have success and cancel and error callbacks, right? And on success, I'm simply going to pull the information that's returned to me and inject that into the page. So we will run this page again, and we'll go and select a file from OneDrive. Now when I revisit this page and I go to my pickers page, now that I've added the JavaScript, I can actually click on the button. So we'll select the Select from OneDrive button, and you'll notice a new window opens, and it is going to then navigate to the OneDrive for Business of the current user. Right? So the OneDrive file picker opens with the OneDrive for Business for the current user. There are no files in this particular OneDrive account. However, I get the full OneDrive experience. You'll notice on the left-hand side, various groups that I have joined as well are shown. So we can then navigate through those various folders and find the specific file that we might need to do our work, right? And so again, you see me drilling down. I'm going to choose this PowerPoint. So it's the Fabricam 3D printer brochure. And then I can choose the open button. And now what's returned to my application is the file name. And you'll notice here is the download URL that I could then click on to download that file. Next, we want to add the OneDrive People Picker, the Office UI Fabric People Picker to this. So we're going to leave the application running and we're going to return back to Visual Studio. Okay. And now I need to add some components to my project, right? So we're going to right click on the components folder and choose add new item. And we want a TypeScript file. So again, TypeScript JSX, which is the TSX is the default extension for React components in TypeScript. So I'm going to start with just the people picker example data. We're not going to focus necessarily on the calls out to Microsoft Graph to get the people picker information at the moment. We're going to just focus on the information that we need to get the to render the card. So I'm going to choose in the lab files we have the file. I'm going to open this. So we'll put this information into the example file, and then we need to actually create our people picker component as well. So I'm going to right click again and add another file. And returning to my lab files again, we'll choose the people picker code. And we'll put that into our file, and we'll take a quick look at what's happening here. So we're importing the information that we need from React. We're importing the various controls that we need from Office UI Fabric, right? And then, again, this is sample code is right from the Office UI Fabric page, but we're going to then instantiate this with a list of users. And so you'll notice down here my React component, I'm going to output the normal people picker with all the various event handlers all coded in here. And this is a typical pattern you'll see in React. But the point being that the people picker from the Office UI Fabric gives you all types of information about what people type in information, and when they choose them, how to handle it and how to resolve what's going to happen. Again, you notice there's some here that are just writing to the event log, but you can certainly get full control over how you want to handle a user picking a person. Now, I need to include this people picker in my components that get built, and that's part of the boot.tsx file here and the way that this project is structured. And so I want to then include, I'm sorry, I clicked on the wrong file, click on the boot one, and now I need to add that code. So first of all, I'm going to have an import that I need to add at the top, and I'm going to just anywhere among the imports, right, is the ability to say import. And so I'm importing the people picker class from the people picker file, and then I have a function here I'm going to add to this that's going to render this. This is a call I can make to render this. So you see here I'm specifying the people picker. I'm going to put it into the React people picker element. And now if I go back to my view in this is the index.cshtml. you'll notice I already have this React view in here. So this is the place where it will then insert that code here, right? But there's one thing I want to do is to make sure that this page then calls into that render method that I defined. Then in the index.cshtml for my view inside this, in addition to making the call or having the function defined for my OneDrive file picker, I'm also going to have the script that will then call into that method I added to the boot. If I go back to the browser and refresh my page, you'll notice I now get a box. This is the default rendering experience for People Picker, and clicking in the box then shows a pop-up of this is the most recently used list, and I can type in information here to filter this down. Again, this is the sample that is provided by my Office UI Fabric. But I've added this now to my application and can process this as I see fit. Now we'll move on to the other types of cards that are available in the Office UI Fabric. We're going to discuss the persona or face file card, the documents and activity card, hover card, and then we'll add a couple of these cards to our demo app. The face file and persona card are what we use to represent users inside of our content. But the dev.office.com page has some specific best practices that they recommend for consistency with your application with Office 365. And so you want to make sure you follow those as well. Right? In general, the key things we're going to point out is that we're focused on user information here. We're going to either show their avatar or picture from the graph or initials. You would typically include their name, title, and department information, and optionally the presence information. That's all that we would want to be showing here. We aren't necessarily wanting to use this card to put other information here because the user's expectation within the Office 365 application suite is this information. You often use these as part of a document card or a hover card, so it's not often that you would use a persona card or a face file card all by itself. It would generally be in conjunction with other cards to provide contextual information, who modified a document or who participated in a conversation, right? There are cases, though, however, where you may want the persona card, and that is generally the logged in user on the upper right, and that's what we'll do in our demo to show that. The next card to discuss is the document card, and the document card is a multi-purpose card. Is probably the most popular that you would use to show information. Right? There are multiple parts about a document card, and you can pick and choose the parts that you need. They include a preview image, a logo, title, location, which would be a web address, activity, history, the person who performed the activity, actions and status as the full list. Right? And so you can see a snippet here of how a document card then is built using various pieces. This example in our slide deck is talking about showing the latest documents in a OneDrive, and so the location would then just be the URL. Right? There is a compact layout available as well instead of using all these individual pieces, but the key thing for the document card is that you find the information or decide what is the most important information from your application and use the appropriate type of card and subcard information to render that information. Most often you'll be pulling this information from Microsoft Graph, and we'll show that in our demo as well. The last card is a hover card, and this is typically what we would see in a search result page, or if I have a document card and I want to show more information about a specific item, I can do so using a hover card. A hover card is invoked using JavaScript, and you can see the snippet we have here, how there is going to be events that will run on top of a content item of some sort, in which we will then show the hover card. And if I then move my mouse over the hover card, I can show an expanded view. Right? The idea here is that I can then provide the information to the users if they need it. I have a much sparser initial display that's easier to consume. I'm not packing too much information at first, but if I want to get there without a lot of work, I can have this hover card. The hover card component gives you complete control of that experience. You can decide the open and closing and rendering events that happen, as well as the information that's in there. There's a full set of properties to define how the spacing is of the hover card. Should it open to the left, right, top, or bottom? The size of the card is completely within your control, and let you present the information in a way that best suits your application. Again, dev.office.com has best practices for using hover cards that you should follow to ensure a consistent experience with the Office 365 suite. So let's add a demo card or two to our demonstration application. Now let's extend this demo to include information about groups on a card. In the application, there is a groups page, which shows us a list of all the unified groups that exist in the tenant. Clicking on a particular group opens a panel which we can show group details. So let's add those details to the app. The group details is part of a React component in our components folder. Right? At the moment, you'll notice it is just outputting the group name and leave it at that. Right? This information gets returned from a call to the backend service to retrieve the groups. So let's just fill out our form here. First thing we're going to do is add some more Office UI Fabric components into our component using the import statement. So you see here all our document card components are added, some image stuff that we can show the icons as we wish, and also some code that we need from the utilities to get the file type icons. Then the first thing I want to show about a group is its mailbox activity, right? So this is an interesting case where I can, even though it says it's a document card, I can use that document card to show other types of information. So inside my class, I'm going to create a new method that's going to get mailbox activity. And what we're going to be doing here is looking at the last conversation that came from the mailbox, including its senders. So I'm going to then get an array of people that are the conversation senders. I also have, about this conversation, I also have its topic. So I'm going to render a document card. The logo I'm going to just put is the Outlook logo because the conversation can be viewed in Outlook. The title is obviously just the latest conversation, and we're hard coding that, but you'll notice here that we're going to get the topic of the conversation and show that again as a document card title. So it seems counterintuitive to have two titles in a card, but I can just consider the document card title component as a heading type information. I want to show that information. Using the activity component, I'm going to say I want to show the message as what the activity is, whatever this latest conversation message is, and then the array of people gets shown as people. Notice I don't have to specify the face pile component here, but this document card activity will render a face pile for me using the people automatically. So now I need to make sure that I actually call this. So I'm going to then change the render method to be a little bit different. So what's going on here? And instead of just returning just the plain H2, I'm going to actually now return the group name and the mailbox activity passing in the conversation and the mailbox URL. So we'll save this information here and we'll let Webpack rebuild. And then as I click on a individual group, I get an error. So let Webpack rebuild that information. And then when I click on a particular group here, now in my detail pane, you can see I have the title, and here's my latest conversation. This particular one only has only has one information, but you'll notice it rendered the people card all by itself. Right? Again, I didn't specify that I wanted to render a persona card. That's handled for me automatically. And then the location lets me view the inbox. And this gives me an easy way to then show information about the latest conversation, and with a single click, get to that. Now, let's do the same thing for documents. So I'm going to create another private method here that is going to be getting the library activity. And this one's a little bit more involved, but we'll step through all the various pieces here because we're doing some additional work to get icons. And so again, I'm creating a private method that is going to be getting the library activity. And you'll see here we're defining we only want to show a certain number of components here. We don't want to show every single document. We just want the most recent, right? So then we look to see we have a call getting into our Office 3 or the Microsoft Graph data to get the document library, and we're going to render differently whether we get one item back or we get a collection of them. Right? If I get only one item back, then I'm going to have my icon be the document file icon. As opposed to getting a collection of them, I'm going to then be rendering the OneDrive icon. right? And so in addition, what we're going to then do is our preview can either be a document. If I get one item, I can show a preview of that single document. If it's a collection of items, then my preview is going to be a small file type icon with a collection of documents. So you end up here with my recent documents being having a collection of images or just one. The other thing to notice here is that if I have a single item, I can say my document card title is the title of that document, whereas if it's more than one, I'm going to do something different. Then I have my library activity, and again, I'm building up using the various pieces. So I have my OneDrive logo. The preview, again, is going to be that preview image of the one document or the collection of them, and a link to that library as well. Now, there's some code in here that will probably be changed as the as Office UI framework gets updated, but I'm doing some work here to look up the icon using the document suffix to determine what the icon type will be. Okay. Now, I need to include this in my output as well, so I'm going to scroll down to the render here, and we're going to end up adding another call in here, and then we'll talk about what the render is doing. And this is more of a React capability than it is necessarily Office Graph or Office UI Fabric information. And so I'm going to then declare a React component of my library activity, which will either be the current library activity or a null value, right? And so you can see we're passing the information that our group into those activities. And then if I get either the library or the mailbox, I will create a new div here called the group activity. And so then below my group name, instead of just outputting the mailbox, I'm including one or both of these activity items. So we'll save that again, and we'll return and we'll let Webpack do its thing. And you can see that Webpack automatically determined, oh, I have a bug. Let's fix that real quick. So I needed to have this to say doc sub 0. I'm sorry, sub I. Real quick, fix that. And again, we'll save and let Webpack do its recompile. And now we can click on a particular group and let it rebuild. You'll notice here this group activity there's no documents in the production line group. Same thing here, we're not finding anything in the marketing campaigns. And we'll scroll down to the product launch, which we saw earlier had some documents. And now you'll see for the product launch, we have 3 different pictures. You know, the icon is just a picture with a link to the library, and then also we have our latest conversation, and so we have this full information here, right? And this lets us add cards to our application using Office UI Fabric. The last section of our module, we'll talk about using adaptive cards, right? So adaptive cards is a technology that is industry-wide, and the idea of adaptive cards is to provide the ability for developers to provide a data packet, if you will, using a specific schema to a rendering application, and the application can then render that as necessary. On the slide here, you'll see some key capabilities of adaptive cards. Right? It's portable and expressive content. It lets me choose colors and icons and text sizes to express my content regardless of the app or device that it's going to be running on. Right? There are additional controls you can add to adaptive cards. We won't be doing that in this module. There is a different training content module that covers adaptive cards in depth that covers input controls as well. But one of the key benefits for most application hosts is that a developer is not providing code or not providing rendering commands. I'm not providing any insecure data. It is simply a declarative set of data, and the host UI Fabric can then render as it sees fit to match its look and feel. So let's go through and we'll talk about some adaptive card stuff that we can do in our application using the Microsoft Graph. In this demo, we're going to add one last card to our demo application, an adaptive card. In this scenario, I'm going to show you how you can build an adaptive card payload using the SDK and then render that using JavaScript. What you see on the screen now is a Visual Studio project inside the code behind in a group data controller. The group data controller is what is retrieving the data from Microsoft Graph and passing it to the React components. I've set a reference to the adaptive card NuGet library, and you can then see that we are able to use strongly typed classes to build information. We're going to have a container that has our info, and an adaptive column set will provide data in two columns. The left column will be heading, and the right column will be the value, the data, similar to like a key value pairs you would expect. In addition, I'm going to have the column, or I'll put a picture so I can have an adaptive image, which would be the group's icon if it has been set. Otherwise, the initials, if you will, of the group. Again, data from Microsoft Graph that I'm going to then render. Right. So after rendering the picture and the title, and then we can come down here, we add our columns in here, and a particular data that we're going to put in our column is a set of facts. And so the facts would be any classification that has been specified on the group, the visibility of the group, which would be public or private, right, the type, which I'm going to expect to see unified group on all of them, and the date it was created. And you'll notice that I'm going to put a token in here, which is a double curly brace date, and then a format string using short. This string here lets me use my data, instructs the host renderer to use whatever the date, the short date formatting string is for the current locale of the user. So again, I'm going to output a UTC date and time, but it'll be rendered to the user's local time automatically for me as part of adaptive cards. I do the same thing under policy if it exists, and so I'm generating this card, and what I end up returning is the group card value. I'm going to set a breakpoint here, and we will then see the values that we end up getting. So we'll start this, and while we let that compile, I'm going to switch over to our the group details control. We're going to extend this now that we want to include our card, right? So there's a couple steps that we're going to have to do here. We're going to want to include a group card component, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So in our group detail, I'm going to go up to the top here, and in our import section, we're going to import a group card. And then we need to change the rendering to also include that. So instead of just rendering the title as an H2, I'm going to actually render the group card. And so I'm going to put an H2, which is the group information, then a document card that has the group card, and then below that I will output the activity. Right? And so let's look at what this group card is. So this is a React component, and you'll notice here we're importing a different NPM package called adaptive cards. This is the JavaScript HTML rendering SDK for adaptive cards. Right? And so in this rendering becomes quite simple. I'm going to be getting a set of data. If you remember back in my group detail, when I'm rendering the group card and I'm passing in that group object's going to have the card as a data property, the info card. Right? And I'm going to just simply pass that into the render adaptive card method, and you can see that down below. And then I'm going to return that and render that in React. Now, React is telling us if you are rendering raw HTML, that's dangerous. Where did that raw HTML come from? Have you validated that data? In my example, I'm confident that that data is coming from a source that I trust because it's coming from me. I'm rendering that card as well. This private render adaptive card method actually calls into that SDK. So I can just create a new instance of the adaptive card. I can specify some host configuration attributes, which in this case is going to be the font that I'm choosing. And I simply parse the string, the JSON document. By parsing that, we'll create an in-memory version of that card, and I can specifically say I want you to render that. That render method is going to return an HTML element, and I want the inner HTML of that to render to my card. So we've added all these pieces together. Let's go to our group, and we'll choose one, and we'll watch remember we set a breakpoint, so if we go back to the product launch, which is our group that we've been using, we're going to then end up with a breakpoint here in Visual Studio. Right. And here's our group card. Again, this is the strongly typed object of what we're building. So I'm going to step over a couple of steps up here, and now you can see the info card property of my detail, right? And here it is, the information I have My body has two elements in it. If I look at the two elements, it's two different containers. The top container is going to be the image, and the bottom one will be the fact. Right? Okay. We'll step through this a little bit further, and we let this run. And now we'll notice our card renders it an adaptive card format with the title, the visibility type, and the date. And again, we specified the short date for the local user. Right? I'm going to switch to the developer tools view here. And if we look at the, we'll call this in one more time, and we can watch the network. And we'll run this. And if we look at the network statistics here, our group information, if I look here, this info card, you'll see this is a big JSON object. I want to look at the response object. Oh, my apologies here. So we get the response object. You'll notice in my JSON object after the picture, I'm going to then have all this information. You'll notice my delivered date and so on. And this is my info back here, right? So I end up building the JSON object that has the information that's going to be shown, right? And we'll go back to the sources and let this continue. Then you will then see that work. I really don't like how this turned out. So when I click on my group, now instead of just seeing the group name as an H2, you will see that it will render the group information inside of a card, and below that we'll have our activity.